Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Hey, Kai Wright is back with us. WNYC listeners will know him from his years here, most recently as host of Notes from America and Season 3 of the podcast Blind Spot. He's now co-hosting a new video podcast from The Guardian US called Stateside with Kai and Carter, dropping 3 times a week. His co-host is Carter Sherman, an award-winning journalist who covers reproductive rights, sexual violence, and LGBTQ plus issues, and who wrote the book, The Second Coming, about Gen Z's relationship with sex in post-Roe, post-Me Too America. She's also with us. Among the stories they've covered so far on Stateside, the Supreme Court's recent decision gutting so much of the Voting Rights Act. They talked to Stacey Abrams about that. We'll play a clip. And a violent ICE arrest in Los Angeles. We'll play a clip of Carter on that as well. So, Kai, welcome back. Carter Sherman, welcome back to WNYC.
It is so nice to be here, Brian. And I got to tell you, that there's nothing like coming back for break, listening to that bass line again. It's lovely stuff.
I'll just say thank you for having us.
Kai, tell us about Stateside. What do you set out to do in each episode? Because I gather this isn't a show where you just lay out the facts and step back.
No, I mean, the idea here is Carter and I are, one, we start every episode in conversation with each other, trying to, as the tagline says, make sense of it all. It's just that, the news comes at you so fast, as you well know, as all of the listeners of this show well know. And it's a lot of similar work that you're doing here, of just trying to be like, wait. Can we slow down a minute? And dig in on one thing and actually understand it, leveraging the Guardian's global newsroom. Carter, you like to say, also you talk about this, just the way that so much of YouTube, where we're at, the space we're in, is filled with less productive conversations.
It's a lot of influencers spouting off on opinions and not really providing as many facts. And I think for me, one of the things I'm so excited about is that we do get to bring this very well-resourced newsroom to YouTube and expand the Guardian's reporting into this new format.
Yeah. Cool. Carter, by way of introduction for listeners who may know Kai's work much better than yours, what would you say are the questions that animate you as a journalist, and what you were talking a little bit about what drew you to this project, but how does it connect, let's say, with your book, The Second Coming, about Gen Z's relationship with sex in, post-Roe, post-Me Too America, or any other way you want to describe what animates you as a journalist?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great one. I think one of the main animating forces for me as a journalist is understanding what people who are not in the White House, in the corridors of power, are going through. What does it mean for these decisions to be made for them, and how does it feel for them? And I think that's one of the things that I was really excited about for a recent episode of Stateside that we did that you mentioned, where we spoke with a young man who had been violently arrested by ICE, because I really feel like it's so important to spotlight these people's experiences and show people what it's like on the ground in the United States, especially today, because so much is changing so quickly and oftentimes for the worse in the United States.
Kai, I see you interviewed Stacey Abrams about the Supreme Court's recent voting rights decision. Let's play about a minute and a half of Stacey Abrams from that episode. Here we go.
I think it's important for us to resituate where we are in this conversation. Mm-hmm. This is no longer a battle of Democrats versus Republicans. This isn't red versus blue. We're in a competitive authoritarian state. And in competitive authoritarianism, democratic institutions, small d democratic, those institutions become the weapons of authoritarianism because you hollow out what they mean, you compromise their accountability, you erase their legitimacy by using the very laws that people have come to accept as the tools for governance. And the reason this matters is that Winning in Tennessee was never going to be about stopping the maps. They are going to do this. We have got to accept that. The answer, though, is what do we do in response? We have to respond using the courts. Even if the courts do not rule in our favor, we still have to fight in the courts. We do it at the ballot box because in Tennessee, because they have fractured these districts, they are likely to win. Absolutely. But they now have created 3 new opportunities where they have fractured communities and said, we're going to scatter these seeds. Our job is to grow. Our job is to use the scattering and say, okay, fine, you took the one we had. Well, now you've given us 3 opportunities to come back.
Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia state senator, who's definitely got a national profile in the area of voting rights advocacy and some other things. You know, that clip surprised me a little, Kai, because her argument is essentially keep fighting in the courts, even when the courts rule against you, as well as, maybe more intuitively, keep fighting at the ballot box, even as the districts get redrawn. But it certainly sounds like she's trying to fight against hopelessness, that especially black voters and especially black voters in these districts that are being destroyed might feel right now.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, the reason I wanted to talk to her was my own hopelessness. And she is someone who, as you point out, you know, I have covered her work on voting rights for a long time. So I wanted to speak with somebody who could say, okay, what's the hands-on response here? You know, how do we get past wringing our hands about it? And I think, Brian, the piece of that there were 2 pieces of that I thought were really useful for me. One was her opening point of like just the framework that we are now in a place as a country where the state has been weaponized against democracy. And that's an important mental shift that I think a lot of Americans have to make, where we're still in this space where we're always like, oh, well, you know, we have these institutions, they're going to function, we just have to wait for the next election. And what she's trying to tell us is that we live in a place now, that's that competitive authoritarianism, where like an authoritarian regime has weaponized the state and its institutions against democracy. So that's just an important starting place to understand it. But then the more hopeful piece of it that I did think was useful because it was concrete was to think the courts part. I don't know. I find it hard to take faith in that. But the piece where she says, okay, well, listen, you know, we've been here before historically, and yes, it's hard. But what they have done in fracturing the black vote out of one district is create a 33% black vote in 3 districts now. You know, and so this is now coalition politics. You have to now, the work is to convince non-black voters in those districts, whatever they are, that we are no longer in a conversation about Republicans and Democrats, that we're in a conversation about fundamental rights as Americans, and can you ally with us so that we can change this? And then we can get back to a conversation about Republicans versus Democrats, you know? So I found that like a useful framework, that the work here at this point, like it or not, is coalition building and trying to get that number in those districts. And this is now in Tennessee from 33% to 50% of people who say, I'm not okay with the state weaponizing itself against democracy, you know?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, some people call that the risk of dummy mandering, creating these new districts that may, in some cases at least, wind up backfiring on mostly the Republicans, but whatever party does it, because you put all these Democrats into what was a safe Republican district, as you were describing, and then maybe that 1/3 starting out can build up to a coalition of 50%. Carter, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that phrase. I know it was Kai's interview, but competitive authoritarianism. This is the second time in the last week that phrase has come up on the show. Andrew Morantz from The New Yorker cited it in his article about the defeat of Viktor Orban in Hungary. I forget who he said coined it, competitive authoritarianism, to describe what they had in Hungary, what he had instituted, which was kind of like how Kai was just describing it. You know, yes, it's competitive. You can lose an election, as he did, but he had built up so many state institutions that made that harder and that worked against democracy in other ways that didn't just have to do with the ballot box. So I'm just curious if that's been a thought-provoking concept for you, competitive authoritarianism.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that this was a phrase I frankly did not know until Trump came back into power last year. And I started thinking about these questions of, okay, are our elections free? Are our elections fair? And I think that really it's incumbent upon Americans to think about this question also in a historical context. Like, do we think that elections throughout American history have been free and fair? And the answer, as I think Kai would agree with, is not really, not often. And one of the things I really appreciated about the conversation, Kai, that you had with Stacey was that you guys were talking about this history and bringing listeners, viewers into this space where they can understand, okay, this is not unprecedented. This moment, versions of this moment have happened before in the past. And guess what? People have gotten outraged and people have made change. It is possible to improve from this moment. And I think that that was really important, at least for me to hear, because frankly, if I feel hopeless or not optimistic, then I hear someone like Stacey Abrams talking, and I'm like, wait, what right do I have to be pessimistic in this way?
But it also reminds me of, so another conversation Carter and I had on the show is that aired yesterday about reproductive justice and the fact that there are so many. The point is, there's so many things that are that this particular regime wants that are deeply, deeply unpopular.
Undemocratic.
And undemocratic. And that the only way, as you were explaining it to me, Carter, the only way that they can achieve the wide restriction of abortion rights that they want is through deeply undemocratic means.
Right, because most Americans do support some degree of access to reproductive rights. And so if you're someone who is in the anti-abortion movement, if you are someone who's in the anti-abortion movement, if you believe that abortion should be banned, you have to resort to undemocratic means to make that goal real. And I think this is one of the things that I've been really enjoying about the show, Kai, is that we both have a lot of opinions and a lot of takes.
Yes.
Spend a lot of time going back and forth.
Yes. But competitive authoritarianism, I think it's a really important framework for understanding where the United States is right now.
And listeners, if you're just joining us and recognize one of these voices, who maybe you haven't heard here in a little while, yes, it's Kai Wright, who used to host Notes from America on WNYC, as well as other things that he did here, now co-hosting a new video podcast from The Guardian US called Stateside with Kai and Carter. Our other guest is co-host Carter Sherman, an award-winning journalist who covers reproductive rights, sexual violence, and LGBTQ plus issues, and who wrote the book The Second Coming about Gen Z's relationship with sex in post-Roe, post-Me Too America. She's also with us. Anybody want to react to anything you're hearing so far? We're going to play another clip from their new podcast on another topic coming up, but our lines are open if you want to call or text 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. Here's a text, Carter, that says, I am a Tennessean from the mountains where we African Americans are only 2% of the population. Memphis, meaning that congressional district, Memphis had to speak for all of us. It's a much greater loss to this black 77-year-old and my neighbors than the nation has realized.
I mean, that is just devastating to hear. And I want people in this country to have a voice. I want people in this country to feel like their vote matters. And it's so upsetting to me as someone who believes in the promise of the United States that people don't feel like that is the case anymore and that their government is working against them to undermine democracy, as Kai has pointed out.
Yeah, and as I said to Stacey Abrams, actually, to speak to this gentleman, I am of an age, my mother and that gentleman remember a time, we're alive at a time when the act of voting was in the South, put their lives at risk. And I think it's so easy to think about that as distant history. But my mother was an adult when that was true. And our texter was an adult when that was true. So it is very recent history, and I can see why it would be difficult to sit in Tennessee and see us going back to it.
You cite that history from those past generations. Here's a pushback question along those lines. Before I knew you were coming on with a Stacey Abrams clip, I had recently read an article, because I read everything across the political spectrum, or a lot, in the Conservative National Review, and the headline of this piece was Stacey Abrams and the Left Redefine Jim Crow. And it started with House Speaker Mike Johnson supporting the rationale of the Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act. And then they quote Stacey Abrams saying of Johnson, he's saying it brings back 1964, 1963, 1892, and then the article says that she listed many ways in which Black Americans were disenfranchised in the past: poll taxes, literacy tests, and the grandfather clause, in which one could bypass racial voting restrictions if one's ancestors were allowed to exercise the franchise prior to the Civil War. And the article says each of these obstacles has been demolished, and some might say that constitutes progress, not Abrams, who says, quote, "What Johnson is celebrating is the return of Jim Crow to the South." So I think what National Review's writer is doing there is saying, at very least, a lot of white Americans and maybe some other Americans are going to be put off by the rhetoric that says this isn't just aiming for a race-neutral solution for discrimination, but that somehow it puts us back to Jim Crow, which he argues it doesn't, and is a rhetorical overreach. Any reaction?
I think what the National Review writer is doing there is trying to have his cake and eat it too. So all the laws, all the things that made that progress that we all can agree on. Absolutely. The Voting Rights Act was one of the most successful laws in the history of American laws. I was trying to do these numbers off the top of my head. Forgive me if I fudge them a little bit, but just before the Voting Rights Act passed in the state of Mississippi, Black voter registration was under 5%. Within a couple of years after it passed, Black voter registration was in the 60-something percentiles. It was one of them. It expanded democracy remarkably. It was a successful law. Absolutely. We can, I hope, all agree on that. That is the tool that did it. So how can you now argue that we don't need those tools? It's like saying that, my car works really well. I don't need it. No, I'm butchering the metaphor, so I'll leave it alone.
Well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg made a comment in an earlier Supreme Court decision that was around preclearance, which was another part of the Voting Rights Act. This decision by the conservative majority at the time in the Supreme Court gutted the preclearance sections of the Voting Rights Act, and she compared it to throwing out your umbrella because it's not raining.
There you go.
And
leave it to Ruth Bader Ginsburg to say it better than me.
But I feel like that's what you're talking about, is that we're throwing away the tools that made all of these advancements possible and then acting as if those tools never did anything for us.
It's also this rhetorical game that folks are playing here to try to avoid just looking at the facts on the ground. And so the biggest indication of what we're talking about is that within moments of the court ruling this, all of a sudden, there were no more majority black districts in the state of Tennessee. And in several states in the South, all of a sudden moved to remove all of the black districts. So the outcome is the outcome, and it would be different if we were like, oh, well, let's wait and see what happens. Maybe it's not such a big deal. But immediately they began redrawing the maps in a way that has an explicit racial outcome while claiming it doesn't. So I think they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
All right, let's go on to another story from your new podcast. Carter, you reported on the arrest of a Los Angeles man named Christian Cerna, a U.S. citizen, a carpenter, a father of two. This is Christian Cerna himself describing the scene when ICE came for him.
80 yards of just pure militarized guys with guns and masks, and it was like couple platoons of the military almost, it's like, I think you guys are deployed in the wrong side of town, because it's like, there's no war zone going on here. And I made that very clear to them. I told them, I was like, you guys are not warriors. You guys are not going to win a war here. There's no way shooting at you guys, and they just like laugh and smirk off, and they just disregarded all of it. But it was surreal, for sure. Like a movie scene.
So, Carter, walk us through what happened, because a lot of Americans have not heard this story. It's been in the press a little bit, but tell us the basics of the Christian Cerna ICE encounter.
Yeah, so a slight correction there. That's actually Christian talking about a protest he attended in summer 2025 in Los Angeles. No, I mean, it's connected to what happened, which is that he went to this protest. Christian has very strong feelings about immigration enforcement. His father was deported as a child. And this was at a time that ICE was swarming the city of Los Angeles. They arrested some 1,600 people, including U.S. citizens, including people who were going to immigration hearings. And so he attended this protest. He would admit, get a little heated, and he took a swing at a federal officer. Now, there is a question of whether or not he actually made contact. The government would say that he did. Christian says that he didn't. But regardless, a few days later, he was driving with his family. His partner was in the car. His 2 young children were in the car. And 2 cars slammed into him from either side. And this was ICE. ICE got out of the car. Their agents had their guns drawn. They ordered him to get out of the car, and they violently arrested him. And what really sets Christian's story apart, I think, and one of the reasons we ended up covering it, as well as my colleague Sam Levin, who brought this story to us, they filmed this arrest. ICE filmed the arrest in high-resolution footage. They filmed themselves getting ready for the arrest. They filmed themselves following Christian. And then they ultimately put that video of the arrest online on social media. And so they effectively used him as propaganda. And this is really part of an ongoing strategy we're seeing from ICE in the wake of the Trump administration's return to power, where the agency is effectively acting like influencers. And so for us, it was really important to cover this to show people the way that ICE is running a kind of PR campaign.
So the incident was last year, but is it that the video just recently got released?
It is that Christian's court case has finally finished, and he was able to speak to Sam and to speak to us publicly about what had happened. Because as all of this was going on in the courts, obviously lawyers tend to say, don't talk to the press.
And how did it resolve?
He ended up pleading guilty to the misdemeanor charge of assaulting a federal officer, which technically actually doesn't require you to have made contact with an officer. And he told me that the reason he pled guilty is because, he was looking at spending up to 8 months in jail, and he just could not do that to his family. He had to have this uncertainty be over. He had to be present for his children. But he really feels very strongly that the way that he was arrested was not right, that this is not the way that people should be treated in this country, and that ICE really put his children and his partner in danger.
Nora in Sleepy Hollow keyed on the Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote you were referencing before and wants to talk about that. Nora, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. What she actually said in her dissent in the earlier ruling was not that it's like throwing away, pardon me, your umbrella because it's not raining. It's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. The reason you're not getting wet is that you have an umbrella.
Thank you for the clarification. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a better wordsmith than even I remember.
Right, as that related to the pre-clearance aspect of the Voting Rights Act, which got thrown out by the court's majority while she was still on the court. That was, as you were referencing before, that states with a history of racial discrimination had to get approval from the federal government before they would engage in redistricting. So that's the umbrella, right? The umbrella was protecting them from potentially getting wet, and they took away the umbrella. So interesting. Carter, what else is coming down the pike on stateside?
Well, I feel like I can't give away too much at this time, but I am excited about the episode that we just put out. As Kai was referencing earlier, it is about the recent Supreme Court decision around abortion pills. I've covered abortion rights for 10 years now, and it really, to me, was not, I think people really saw this Supreme Court decision as being the final word on abortion rights. When it comes to pills, that abortion pills will remain accessible. And in the episode, I really lay out why that is not the case, why this is a battle that we really need to be paying attention to if you are someone who cares about access not only to abortion pills, but to all abortions. Because the Trump administration, as it turns out, has a tool it could use to ban abortion nationwide.
I wonder if either of you, I'm throwing you a curveball here because, this came up earlier in the show, but not something that we talked about in advance would come up here. A reaction to Barney Frank, who of course just passed, and he gave a number of interviews just before he died, because he wanted to talk to the Democratic Party, his colleagues, his allies in the Democratic Party, about not trying to go too far too fast. And then when you do that, you lose elections. So it was about incrementalism, which he defended, and I played clips of him saying the exact same thing on this show back in 2015. Carter, I wonder if you've been keying on that Barney Frank story that's been circulating about his recent interviews.
I can't say that I've been paying too much attention to it just because there's so much news happening these days. And so I've been a little overwhelmed this morning by looking at what's going on with Cuba, what's going on with the DNC autopsy report. And I am certainly not a Democratic Party strategist, so I don't mean to tell the Democrats how to run their business. But I do think that what I hear from people when I speak to individuals on the ground, because that is such a core part of my reporting practice, is that they would like to hear a vision. They would like to hear a strategy. They would like to hear some kind of message be defined. And so I'm curious to see if the Democrats can articulate something that people feel is grabbable, that people feel is like strong and present. Because I don't know that people feel like that's happening right now.
Since you brought it up, do you have a take yet on the Democratic Party autopsy report, what went wrong in the 2024 election that just broke during the show, and I haven't had a chance to look yet?
I mean, I started reading it because I was hearing on your show that it had just come out. So to be honest, I have not gotten to the end. But it does not quite feel like there is a really cohesive message coming out of that report. That said, I think the thing that people have really been snagged by is the fact that they hadn't released the report up until today, as I understand it. And so it's very interesting to me that the DNC is trying to rebuild trust, is trying to tell voters, we are the party of the future, when they're not necessarily being as transparent as they previously said they would be.
Yeah, and the one thing I did see that has left me kind of confused so far is that the DNC chair, Ken Martin, released the report saying he released it because there was so much pressure from so many Democrats to release it, but saying that he doesn't believe that what's in the report is trustworthy, that it wasn't, conducted or vetted well enough to be conclusive. So that's just even further confusion around the whole question of the autopsy report. Kai, a couple of things that you've got going on. Before we go, I see you've got another podcast, Big Lives, from the podcasting company Pushkin, with also with a co-host, and you profile iconic cultural figures. You want to pick one person you've covered and tell us something about them that maybe reframed how you think about their legacy?
I'm the hardest working man in podcasting, Brian. I got a lot of stuff out. The idea is that we're looking at people who just have become so famous that they are caricatures of themselves at this point. And we get to go back through the BBC's archives and find sort of moments in history to tell stories about. I think my favorite episode thus far was on Richard Pryor, because it's really was wrestling with his self-destruction and the ways in which I feel like there's something sort of universal. Can something be sort of universal? But there's something bigger in the experience of Black people of his generation with that level of ambition, who make it, quote unquote, in mainstream and white spaces, but don't feel like they want to be there still. And what that does to them. And so that's what that episode's about.
So that's Big Lives with you and Emmanuel Jochi. And let me just let listeners know that you're coming back into WNYC's orbit.
That's right.
For a live on-air special next Wednesday night here at WNYC with Theater of War, broadcasting live from the BAM event stage. For listeners who don't know Theater of War, it's a project that we've been collaborating with where famous actors do dramatic readings of a piece of writing, and then the phones open up for conversation. So tell us about the piece that you've chosen, who the actors are, and why this particular piece for this particular moment.
The phones have been blowing up every time we've done this, by the way, so please listen and chime in. This one is going to be, the actors are Bill Murray, Oscar Isaac, and Lois Smith. And we are reading a piece from The New Yorker about AI and loneliness, which I know, Carter's topic that you have digged into, by the way, is whether or not AI bots can help in the loneliness epidemic, or will they just make it worse? So the actors perform it, and then we open up and folks talk about it, and it's just generally a great time.
So that could be a future episode of Stateside,
Exactly.
AI chatbots and loneliness.
All right, so that's going to be from BAM, but live on WNYC next Wednesday night. Kai Wright and Carter Sherman co-host Stateside with Kai and Carter, the new video podcast from Guardian US. New episodes 3 times a week. Kai, as I said, is also co-host of Big Lives from Pushkin, and we'll be back on WNYC next Wednesday night for that live Theater of War special. Thanks for joining us today. Good luck with the new projects.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So every Tuesday on the show for a few years now, we've been doing a health or climate story of the week. This began when we saw the climate getting what we thought was too little attention in the media because the climate doesn't change at the speed of the news cycle, does it? Then when the Trump administration and RFK Jr. came in with their radical overhaul plans for public health policy, we expanded it to a health or climate story of the week. As it turns out, our story in public radio and television intersects with the story in public health in that both have been marked not just by policy change, but by defunding. For this week's segment, we welcome back Caitlin Jetelina, a recurring guest and one of my favorites in this series. Caitlin writes a newsletter called Your Local Epidemiologist. An epidemiologist is someone who studies the spread of disease and what seems to cause or prevent it. Caitlin's been writing recently to explain the Hantavirus outbreak, and now in today's newsletter, the Ebola outbreak, a much bigger deal, actually, and the risks to people here. But she also had a New York Times op-ed last week that gets to the structural problem with defunding public health. It's called Our Public Health Agencies Have No Leaders. What could possibly go wrong? So, Caitlin Jetelina, your local epidemiologist, always good of you to give us some time. Welcome back to WNYC.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with your op-ed, and then I'm sure our listeners will want to hear your take on the Ebola news today, that it's spreading faster than first realized. You begin your op-ed with the resignation of the Food and Drug Administration head, Dr. Marty Makary. He was a Trump and RFK appointee, so what does his departure signify to you?
Well, this is just another departure along a long list. And I think that a lot of these leaders were very critical of the government, in some ways rightfully so, in some ways not, during COVID-19, and is just another example of mistaking, hard, unglamorous work of institutional change. He just didn't have the leadership to do it, or the ability or strategy to do it. And what makes me incredibly concerned is that all of this is playing in a background with other diseases coming more quickly, and also on top of families already feeling very abandoned by the health system and overwhelmed by medical bills.
You wrote that despite Dr. Makary's credentials as a creative physician and scientist, the FDA became less reliable and transparent under his leadership. How, for example?
I mean, how long do we have here? There is a very long list. I will say, and I said this in the op-ed, that there are some things that he did do, like integrating AI to make sure that clinical trials go faster, being able to share data more often or more transparently. But these are all overshadowed by a very long list, like I said, of that Tylenol and autism,
that was on his
press
watch.
conference.
Yep.
Yeah, and stopping rare disease medications and the approval process, the whole review of a new flu vaccine from Moderna, and then reverse course. And along the way, losing countless high-quality staff members with impeccable integrity, whose job was to keep ourselves safe from diseases and safe from foods and medicines. And the consequences of these actions are just not abstract.
You do credit Makary with a few things, including the reported reason for his resignation, that he didn't want to bow to political pressure to authorize the sale of flavored vapes. You call that an admirable stand. Why do you think so? And why would Team Trump or Team RFK, Make America Healthy Again, want to authorize flavored vapes?
I think we're seeing the influence of massive corporations and their effectiveness of lobbying, particularly this administration. We have seen their effectiveness on other things, like at the EPA and reducing or increasing pollution by reducing regulations. This is just, again, a long list. And it is. I mean, I did give him credit for backing out and not bowing to that political pressure, but it also came a little too late. There's a lot of things he did bow to that are creating the United States to really spin its wheels and even go backwards in a lot of things on health. And I am just fed up with it.
Here, here's the defunding piece that connects with defunding our institution. You wrote funding for core data systems, logistics, and community partnerships has been cut. Research funding is moving at a glacial pace. So what do you see as some of the most consequential aspects of defunding public health research or public health agencies?
I mean, we're seeing it right now play out in real time with the Ebola outbreak. Defunding USAID certainly has an impact on how this outbreak is unfolding. Defunding communications or even firing a lot of people in communications at CDC and the detrimental effect that has on the Hantavirus outbreak. We also, like I said, are defunding a lot of scientific research. In fact, the past 14 months, we stopped research on hantavirus. And so a lot of this is around preparedness. A lot of it will impact us in the short term, but it will impact us in the long term as we continue to get these disease threats that come at us and usually thrive when we are most vulnerable.
Hantavirus, the outbreak on the cruise ship, and now people are being quarantined. You're right, the outbreak remains contained, but there's a countdown to mid-June. What's the countdown?
That's right. So we are in a waiting game for biology to play out. One of the most nasty things about hantavirus is that it takes a long time for and this is called an incubation period, for a viral particle to enter the body once you're exposed, to latch on, to replicate and then cause symptoms. In fact, it takes 42 days, which is very long. And so that countdown began, the 42-day countdown began May 11th in the United States, which lands us at about June 22nd to see if this outbreak grows among these passengers and those exposed to these passengers on an airplane.
And why this matters so much, according to the World Health Organization, in the Americas, hantaviruses can cause hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, a severe respiratory illness with a case fatality rate of up to 50%. So a little background for that, why even though with so few cases and apparently contained, there's so much concern about this. There does seem to be some disagreement over how easily hantavirus spreads. Does it require close person-to-person contact, or can it linger in the air after an infected person leaves a space like COVID can? Do you understand why different takes are out there?
I do. This is a very rare disease. And so because of that, we have limited scientific information on it. We are relying on some small historical outbreaks out there. And I think we are learning in real time, and we will learn a lot from this outbreak. And you're right. One of the biggest questions is how effectively this disease transmits. We know that it transmits very well from rat to human. And we know the specific type of hantavirus also transmits very easily in close contact with other people. The biggest question is, does it linger in the air or for more causal interactions? And the reason that's being brought up is because there's a 2018 Argentina outbreak where a symptomatic patient went to a birthday party, infecting 6 other people, and one person may have only been involved in a brief passing interaction. And this really matters, not because I think this is going to turn into a pandemic, and this is why you're also seeing so much scientific debate around it, is because it really matters for contact tracing, right, to ensure everyone who needs to be monitored is monitored. And it also really matters that scientists collect the right specimens off that ship so we can learn more. But overall, the risk of a pandemic for hantavirus remains very, very small.
So let's go on to the Ebola outbreak in Congo. You cite over 340 suspected cases and 100 deaths, and now there's a travel ban from 3 countries. Briefly, what is the Ebola virus and what makes it so dangerous?
Yeah, this outbreak is incredibly sad and depressing. So the Ebola virus is basically a virus you don't want to mess with. It was discovered in 1976 and it's severe. We're talking like 25 to 90% case fatality rate. And symptoms include fever, severe headache, vomiting, but in the most severe cases, internal and external bleeding. So it is certainly something we don't want to mess with, and how things are unfolding over in Central Africa suggest that the true outbreak is much, much larger than those numbers that you mentioned, and it's going to be tougher to contain over in Central Africa. But to those of us in the United States, the risk to us currently still remains low.
And this brings us back to the defunding. You note in your newsletter that this has been spreading for a while without detection, and you ask, is this because of the cuts to USAID and global health efforts? Your answer is almost certainly yes, for a few reasons. Could you go over 1 or 2 of those?
Yeah, I can. And I think overall, like I said, this is what happens when we dismantle public health systems. Disease thrive in these sort of environments. And so I'm not too surprised that this is getting out of control. 2 of the things that have happened around defunding is around USAID. USAID is was, I guess, an incredibly helpful organization. And in situations like Ebola, and in fact, the last Ebola outbreak, USAID helped train communities on safer burial practices and help set up airport screening to prevent systematic travelers from boarding planes. And then also there's defunding and not defunding and cutting our CDC capacity, right? CDC typically works alongside affected countries and the WHO to expand testing, to coordinate in the early response, to help provide technical assistance. And that is all very much in question right now as this outbreak plays out.
Do you see ideology driving these cuts as opposed to, or in addition to, a desire for the government to save money?
Oh, absolutely. There's ideology. I think that it's very clear that many of these cuts, sure, some of it was to save money, but public health was completely targeted because of COVID-19, I think. And, there needed to be reform. I say that in my New York Times op-ed, that institutions were built for another time, but burning down the house is not a solution given what is happening in this world and what Americans need for their safety and security.
We're in our membership drive, as you know, and we can make up for some or hopefully a lot of the defunding if, we have enough meaning to our listeners that they donate and become members or increase their memberships. What is the public health community doing to compensate? What can it do for the defunding there? You can't, go on the radio and say, hey, help us survive in the way that we can.
Right. And I heard that you have beach towels connected to your drive too. But, I think that what we've been seeing is that states are really stepping up. We have these up in New York, the Northeast Regional Collaborative, really trying to soften the blow of the cuts of public health. But ultimately, public health is funded by the government. It is inherently political. And we are going to continue to see cuts and the ripple effects to this. There are some of us, and me included, trying to fill the gaps outside of government, trying to figure out what a for-profit, mission-driven model can look like so we can sustain these cycles of panic and neglect. But also, ultimately, this means that we need to go to the voting booths and really elect leaders that want to protect our health in a meaningful way, that are willing to strengthen these systems instead of destabilize them. And that's ultimately the power of the people.
That's our health and climate segment, or We Bring the Science segment. For this week, we do one every Tuesday. Caitlin Jetelina, a recurring guest, writes a newsletter called Your Local Epidemiologist. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Now another of the segments we're doing this drive that revisits some recent segments that listeners told us ran too short. Last day of the drive, so this will be the last one. In March and April, we did segments, as we often do, celebrating Ramadan, Passover, and Easter, and inviting callers to say how they observe. During each of those, some of you texted that you were atheists and wanted equal time. So we did a call-in that asked straight up, do you believe in God? If so, why? If not, why not? What makes you so sure, one way or another? Or call in if you're not sure and you're an agnostic. Well, for such a defining question for many people, that segment definitely ran too short, and people wrote in asking for more. So now we'll talk to a leading philosopher of religion about that spectrum of belief, including the contemporary question of why the U.S. is at a record high percentage of people who say they are unaffiliated with any religion. Joining me now, Megan Sullivan, professor of philosophy at Notre Dame and founder of the school's Institute for Ethics and the Common Good. She wrote a book called The Good Life Method, teaches a popular course at Notre Dame called God and the Good Life, was a consultant to the TV series about heaven and hell called The Good Place, that brilliant series, and is currently directing research on the topic of Christian thought in AI ethics. Christian thought in AI ethics. I'll ask about that too. Professor Sullivan, great to have you. Welcome to WNYC.
It's great to be with you, Brian.
In your teaching, do you define God with your students? If we're even asking, do you believe in God? Do you first establish what people mean when they say God?
Absolutely. I think we have to spend 2 weeks on that topic in class. We can spend a few minutes on it here on the radio show, but the key for philosophy is first understanding what you're talking about before you start to debate it.
And so, what is the 30-second radio talk show version?
30-second radio talk show version of what is God? I think most philosophers start by saying that God is whatever being in the universe is omnipotent and morally perfect. So those two kinds of features, if there's anything in the universe that has the power, as the power being the most powerful being that there is and is morally perfect, then that's what we're talking about when we talk about God. And the upshot of that definition is, even if you're not sure which particular world religion, if any of them are true, almost every major world religion that believes in a singular God agrees that God has those two features and nothing else does.
So what purpose or purposes has belief in a God, the way you just define God, served for people? Where would you start to answer that question if you think it's a fairly universal answer?
I love St. Augustine, and he has, I think, an answer to this question that resonates for a lot of people. He says, "My heart is restless until it rests in thee." Basically, for Augustine, he found he was, living his life and trying to search for what ultimately gave his life value and meaning, and trying to understand why this world, which honestly is many days of the week pretty screwed up and full of suffering, why this world would be good in the first place, and found that at the end of the day, a lot of his thoughts and reasoning led him back to this idea that there must be some locus of moral perfection in the universe, and that was God.
And so that reasoning, is that, a common answer to, because what we were asking people in that call-in was, if you do believe in God or if you don't, what makes you so sure? So how common would the answer be for believers?
Well, I'll tell you a contemporary Augustinian answer that I really admire is Stephen Colbert, another one of your fellow New Yorkers. Stephen Colbert, you can Google this on YouTube. He got a question from Dua Lipa about why he believes in God, and his answer kind of evokes St. Augustine, but he says, look, I wake up every morning and I just find I'm grateful for my life and I'm grateful for the world, like all of it, the whole thing. I just feel this gratitude. And gratitude looks for an object. Like you can't just be grateful. You're always grateful to someone or to something. And for Colbert, God is the only being that's the proper object of his gratitude. Like, he can be grateful to his parents for causing him to exist, but his parents didn't make the sunrise this morning. You can be grateful to your boss or your friends or your partner for kindnesses that they give you on any particular day, but you can't be grateful to them for the whole universe. And so Colbert says, like, he has this fact of the gratitude inside of him, and it looks for something to be grateful towards and finds that answer in believing in God. And I think for a lot of folks, that's really one of the arguments that strikes at them when they decide they're going to be curious about a religion, or when they decide they're going to go to church or go to a worship service, is this idea that, man, there's something really, really beautiful and wonderful about this world that deserves more of my focus and attention. And eventually that kind of train of thought leads you maybe to the God that many of these major world religions have also posited.
Although Colbert is an interesting example to use right at this moment when he's getting canceled in what many of his viewers would consider an act of evil. But you defined God earlier as, among other things, that people attribute to God, being all loving and all benign. So why don't more people who are in whatever religion get dissuaded when they see all the suffering in the world, all the injustice?
Isn't this such a mystery about human nature? Some people experience suffering and it really causes them to shut off any curiosity about whether God exists. And in philosophy, we call this the problem of evil. This thought, some people observe evil and suffering in the world and they think there just couldn't be a morally perfect God in this screwed up world. And then other people, I count myself in this camp, certainly Stephen Colbert is in this camp, encounter suffering, and that suffering drives them to want to understand where goodness could be, like what God could be. Colbert is really interesting. Not, having a show canceled is an instance of suffering, but actually, if you know a bit more about his biography, when he was a young boy, his father and two of his brothers died in this totally preventable plane accident. Colbert talks about this quite a bit. It's like that was a period of just incredible suffering for a young kid and his family to go through. But actually thinking about that event and how he continues to be very grateful for his life and the kind of relationship that he had with his mother and his ability to survive that trauma caused him to believe that there must be some deeper, more profound goodness in this life. So suffering, for some people, it drives them away from a religion. But for almost equal numbers of people, it causes them to really seek after God, which is just it's one of the most interesting questions.
You teach ethics. Atheists would say you don't need to believe in God to believe in right and wrong and ethical codes of human behavior. So besides imparting ethics in various codes that are written in various religious scriptures and traditions, how much of the development of religion as a matter of history was really about control by the powerful in society? The first three commandments in the 10 Commandments are, you shall not have any God before me. You can't make idols that are not me, and you can't take my name in vain. And those come before the ethics ones against murder or stealing or bearing false witness. And of course, religious power, church and state, as we tend to call it in this country, have been intertwined in many societies to this day. So how much of prescribing a belief in God has been about the powerful keeping their power?
Oh, now, Brian, you're sounding like Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher who he famously thought that
First time I've been
Jewish
accused
and Christian
of that,
groups.
But go ahead.
Oh, sorry, what'd you say?
First time I've been accused of sounding like Nietzsche, but go ahead.
You could be accused of way worse than being a Nietzschean. Nietzsche is a great philosopher, and a great atheist philosopher. But Nietzsche famously had this idea that Jewish and later Christian groups invented the idea of God because they were constantly on the losing end of like power battles, say with the Roman government, and so they needed to invent a more powerful figure than Rome. And try to convince people to worship their figure because it was the only way they stood a chance at standing up to the Roman Empire. I'm not a Nietzschean. And one of the interesting things about the Jewish and Christian tradition, so the tradition that gives us the Ten Commandments, which you just cited, and this kind of sense of our duties to God, is at the end of the day, in the Jewish and Christian tradition, all of the commandments boil down to two. And both the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition are really clear about this. You are to love God with all of your heart and all of your strength and all of your mind, and you are to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then Leviticus, after you get all 613 mitzvah in the Jewish tradition, all the Jewish commandments, the God clarifies that he thinks at the end of the day, if you can't keep track of all 613 rules and laws, all you really need to remember is the laws of love. And I think that when you really dig into these traditions and what they say the core of ethics is, it's actually quite the opposite of power, at least not power that we understand it in our contemporary American minds. But really, you are called to constantly be digging deep within yourself and finding deeper and deeper capacities to love other people and to love God. And that's just way beyond trying to control people.
My cousin who leads our family seders always says, you can boil down the whole Bible into one line, which is, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. The rest is commentary. So
I love it. One of my favorite points about Jewish ethics, which I learned recently from Rabbi Shai Held, has this awesome book called Judaism is About Love, which I've just loved reading. But at one point, one of the great ancient rabbis was asked this question: why did God just create one atom when he could have created like hundreds? Like, why didn't God create an army in the first instance? And the answer that the rabbi gives to this question is that God wanted to show that every single individual human life had a universe within it, had like everything that was worth loving and caring about already within it. And so that's why God decided to start with one. And I think that's just such a beautiful idea right now. This day and age, we oftentimes don't pay enough attention to this concept of human dignity that's been a central part of Jewish and Christian faith, this idea that every single human being contains a universe that's worth loving. But that is the kind of central teaching of these religions from the very first pages of the Bible, and probably a lesson that it would serve us to pay a whole lot more attention to right now in our country.
I want to get to two more questions before you have to go. One, and you're going to have to do these briefly because I know we're coming on your deadline. Do you teach the converse? Like, where did atheism as a belief come from, and what purpose does it serve for its adherents, or why there's, so much less religious affiliation now in this country than ever before?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most fun things about being a philosophy professor is, going back to Socrates 2,400 years ago, our job is to corrupt the youth with ideas, to give them all kinds of ideas and arguments to help them form their own perspective on these really big human questions. So we cover Nietzsche, we cover the polytheistic religions that the ancient Greeks believed in, and we really try to introduce our students into this great argument that's been going on for thousands of years. And I'm always excited to see where they come down at the end of the class on these big questions. They're wonderful things to think about.
So last question. I mentioned this grant project you're working on about Christian thought in AI ethics. That could be a very short paper, like robots don't have ethics, but what are you actually studying?
So we are, a lot of people think that the technological revolution is just one more nail in the coffin of organized religions like Judaism and Christianity. I think it's quite the opposite. I think a lot of people now have powerful artificial intelligence that's on their phone, it's on their computer, it's in their everyday lives. And it's causing people to ask some really profound questions about what makes being a human being special at all. And the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, these great world religions, they have amazing answers to these questions. So one of our biggest projects is helping reintroduce a lot of folks who maybe haven't had a lot of time to learn about religious ideas or religious philosophy, to reintroduce them to these ideas about human dignity and say, hey, maybe actually there's something to these ideas, especially as we start to realize that it's not, we're not a culture anymore that's like Catholics versus Protestants, but it's really all of humanity against the robots.
Megan Sullivan, professor of philosophy at Notre Dame and founder of their Institute for Ethics and the Common Good. Thank you so much for coming on with us and spending a few minutes exploring some of these deepest questions in human existence. Thank you very much.
Hey, anytime, Brian. This was an absolute blast.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.